Imagine a child born into absolute power, yet raised like a prisoner inside a golden cage. A boy crowned ruler of the largest land on earth before he could even understand the meaning of loyalty. A child who learned early that fear was safer than trust, and that survival required something colder than love. This is the story of Ivan IV, the first Tsar of Russia. A ruler who would expand his realm across endless forests and burning steppe, who would reform the laws of his kingdom with brilliant precision, and who would later drown entire cities in blood under the black banners of his personal terror. Before Stalin, before Lenin, before the machinery of the modern police state, there was a young boy inside the Kremlin who watched powerful men whisper over his head, who saw betrayal in every shadow, and who slowly began to believe that mercy was a weakness no ruler could afford. Ivan was born in 1530, the son of Grand Prince Vasily III, heir to a fragile and rising Moscow state still struggling to unite the fractured lands of medieval Rus. When his father died, Ivan was only 3 years old, too young to rule, yet too important to ignore. Power did not wait for him to grow. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, ruled as regent, trying to hold together a court filled with ambitious boyars, ancient noble families who believed that the throne belonged as much to them as to the child who wore the crown. And then, when Ivan was 8, she died suddenly. Whispers of poison filled the corridors. The boy was left alone. From that moment forward, the Kremlin became less a palace and more a battlefield of invisible knives. The boyards who had bowed before his mother now fought openly for control, dragging the young prince between factions, neglecting him, humiliating him, sometimes starving him, sometimes beating the servants who showed him kindness. Ivan watched, he remembered, he learned that nobles smiled while plotting, that loyalty shifted with opportunity, and that weakness invited cruelty. He wandered the palace halls, unsupervised, reading religious texts and chronicles of past rulers, absorbing stories of divine authority and ruthless kingship, but he also developed darker habits. He found stray animals in the courtyards and tested his power on them, throwing them from the Kremlin walls just to watch them fall. An early rehearsal of dominance over life and death. Historians still debate how much of this was myth and how much was truth. But one fact remains undeniable. Ivan grew up in an atmosphere of fear, suspicion, and calculated humiliation, and children raised in fear do not grow into gentle men. At 13 years old, something shifted. One of the most powerful Bozhars, Prince Andrei Shuasky, entered Ivan's chambers with the casual arrogance of a man who believed the young ruler was still a puppet. But Ivan had been watching for years. He gave a single order. The boyars were stunned as guards seized Shuasky and dragged him away to be executed, purportedly thrown to hunting dogs, while the teenage ruler observed without flinching. It was the first time Ivan used the full weight of the throne. It would not be the last. In 1547, at just 16 years old, Ivan did something no Russian ruler had done before. He crowned himself not as Grand Prince, but as Tsar, a title derived from Caesar. A declaration that Moscow was not merely a principality, but the heir to Rome itself. The third Rome, chosen by God. This was not vanity, it was strategy. If the boyars believed they shared power, Ivan would erase that illusion permanently. If they saw themselves as partners in rule, he would remind them that sovereignty was indivisible. The frightened child of the Kremlin was gone. In his place stood a ruler who believed that only absolute authority could prevent the chaos he had survived. And for a time he seemed brilliant. He reformed the legal code, reorganized the military, created a standing army, and expanded Russian territory eastward into Kazan and Astrakhan, breaking the power of the Tatar Khanates and opening the path to Siberia. Russia grew, trade expanded, the state strengthened. The young Tsar married Anastasia Romanova, and for over a decade those close to him described a ruler who was intense, devout, and increasingly confident, but not yet monstrous. Then, in 1560, Anastasia died, and something inside Ivan shattered. Once again, whispers of poison echoed through the Kremlin halls. Once again, betrayal felt inevitable. But this time, Ivan was no longer a powerless child. He was Tsar, and he would make the entire country feel the fear he had carried since boyhood. The age of reform was ending. The age of terror was about to begin. Ivan was born into a world of gold and blood, where the very air was thick with the scent of incense and the unspoken threat of a dagger. His father, Grand Prince Vasily III, had married Alina Glinskaya after a long and desperate search for an heir to the Rurikid line. And when Ivan arrived, he was greeted as the savior of Moscow. But the celebration was short-lived. In 1533, Vasily died of a leg infection, leaving the Grand Principality to a 3-year-old toddler who could barely hold a scepter. The regency of his mother, Alina, was a period of frantic centralization and defensive politics. She worked to fortify the city and reform the currency, while the Bojar families, specifically the Shweskys and the Belskys, circled the throne like starving predators. They saw the child Tsar as a temporary obstacle to their own territorial ambitions. And for 5 years, Alina held them back with a grit that earned her many enemies in the Moscow court. Ivan watched his mother navigate this field of mines, and he saw her strength as the only thing keeping him alive. But the palace of the Ruriks was a place where strength was often met with chemistry, and in 1538 the shield was removed. Alina died suddenly, and the young Ivan was thrust into a vacuum where he was treated with a neglect that bordered on torture. He was the master of all he surveyed during the state ceremonies, but back in the private chambers he was ignored, left in cold rooms and forced to watch the boyars lounge on his father's furniture and drink from his father's cups. This psychological dissonance, being a god in public and a beggar in private, fractured his sense of self and taught him that the world was composed of masks. After his mother's death, the power fell into the hands of a rotating caste of Bojar regents who turned the state into their personal treasure chest. The Shweskys in particular were known for their arrogance and their blatant disregard for the young prince's dignity. Ivan witnessed the murder of his favorite servants and the imprisonment of his childhood mentors. He saw men who had been loyal to his father dragged through the hallways to be tortured or exiled. And in this period of absolute vulnerability, he retreated into the only place the Bojars could not follow, the vast library of the Kremlin. He became an obsessive reader of the chronicles of the kings of Judah and the stories of the Byzantine emperors. He began to see himself not as a victim of petty aristocrats, but as a divine figure being tested by the devil's agents. He started to vent his mounting rage on the only creatures he could control, the animals of the palace courtyards. He would throw birds and dogs from the high parapets and observe their struggle against gravity with a detached, scientific coldness that chilled those who witnessed it. He was learning the mechanics of terror and the anesthesia of the soul, realizing that to be hurt by no one, he had to be feared by everyone. He was developing a forensic view of human life, where people were either loyal instruments or obstacles to be discarded. A mindset that would later allow him to destroy entire cities without a flicker of remorse. By 1543, the 13-year-old Ivan had seen enough of the boyards' mismanagement and their casual insults to his lineage. The tension reached a breaking point during a meeting of the Boyar Council, when the arrogant prince, Andrei Shawoski, behaved with such disrespect that the young prince felt the last of his patience vanish. For the first time in his life, Ivan realized that the guards standing in the room were not loyal to the nobleman but to the title of Grand Prince. He gave a short, sharp signal, and the guards seized Shawoski in the middle of the council chamber. The nobleman expected a tantrum, but what they got was a death sentence. Shawoski was dragged into the street and reportedly thrown to the pack of hunting dogs that were kept near the stables, where he was torn apart as the young Tsar watched from a window above. This was the moment the wolves of Moscow realized that the child had grown teeth. He was no longer a puppet to be moved between factions, but a predator who was starting to understand the absolute nature of his own authority. He began to appoint his own men to key positions, ignoring the traditional hierarchies of the Bojar clans and creating a shadow government that answered only to him. He was preparing the stage for his final transformation from Grand Prince to something the Russian people had never seen before. In January of 1547, at the age of 16, Ivan did something that would permanently alter the geopolitical identity of the Eastern world. He ordered his advisors to prepare a coronation ceremony unlike any seen in the lands of the Rus. He rejected the traditional title of Grand Prince and demanded to be anointed as Tsar, a title derived from Caesar, signaling to the world that Moscow was the third Rome and the legitimate heir to the vanished glory of the Roman and Byzantine empires. As he stood in the cathedral of the Dormition, draped in heavy robes of gold and the legendary cap of Motomak, he was declaring that his power did not come from the Boyar Council, but from God alone. This was a masterpiece of political theater designed to crush the ego of the ancient aristocratic families, who still believed they were the Tsar's equals. By placing himself in the lineage of emperors, he was making any act of disobedience against him an act of blasphemy against heaven itself. He was no longer a man, but a divine principle of order, and he used this newfound authority to begin a series of radical reforms that aimed to build a professional state out of the chaos of feudalism. He created the Zemsky Soba, the first national assembly, and the Sudebnik, a unified legal code that replaced the arbitrary rules of local lords with a single imperial lord. He was a ruler who saw the future, but his vision was fueled by the cold memory of his past. Realizing that a Tsar must be both the head of the church and the master of the sword, if he intended to survive the wolves that still circled his throne. For centuries, the Khanate of the Golden Horde had loomed over the southern and eastern borders of Moscow, like a dark shadow demanding tribute and launching raids that bled the Russian lands dry. Ivan realized that as long as Kazan and Astrakhan remained independent, Russia would never be a world power, but merely a collection of besieged principalities. In 1552, he launched a massive, holy crusade against the Kazan Khanate, bringing with him a professional army of Streltsy and expert miners from Europe who understood the science of gunpowder and siege warfare. The siege was a brutal demonstration of modern military technology. Ivan's engineers tunneled under the walls of the city and detonated massive explosive charges that literally blew the gates of the east open. When Kazan fell, the massacre was absolute, and Ivan celebrated his victory by building St. Basil's Cathedral on Red Square, with its hypnotic, colorful domes meant to represent the heavenly Jerusalem. He was no longer just a king, he was a conqueror who had expanded his realm into Asia and secured the Volga River for trade. He had achieved more in a decade than his ancestors had in a century, and the Russian people began to look at him with a mixture of awe and terror, believing that he was indeed the chosen instrument of God's wrath. The golden age of Ivan's reign came to a terrifying halt in 1553 when the Tsar was struck by a mysterious and violent fever that brought him to the brink of death. As he lay drifting in and out of consciousness, he called the boyars to his bedside and commanded them to swear an oath of loyalty to his infant son Dmitri to ensure the succession of his line. But to his horror, many of the nobles refused, openly arguing in the next room about who should take the throne while the Tsar's heart was still beating. They favored his cousin Vladimir of Staretsa, believing that another adult male ruler would be easier to manipulate than a child regent. Ivan watched from the shadows of his illness as the masks of loyalty fell away, once again revealing the same ambitious faces that had starved him as a boy. He eventually recovered, but the fever had burned away the last of his mercy and replaced it with a permanent cold suspicion. He realized that his reforms and his victories had changed nothing, and that the boyars were still waiting for a chance to bury the Rurikid line. He looked at his wife, Anastasia Ramonovna, and saw the only person who did not have a dagger hidden behind her back, and his devotion to her became an obsessive anchor for his sanity. He was a man who had seen the void, and he knew that the only way to prevent the boyars from taking his crown was to take their lives first. In 1560, the fragile peace of the Kremlin was shattered by the death of Anastasia Romanovna, the woman who had been the only bridge between Ivan's humanity and his inner darkness. The Tsar was inconsolable, throwing himself against her coffin and screaming in a grief that sounded like the breaking of a soul. He convinced himself that she had not died of natural causes, but had been poisoned by the boyars, who hated her influence over him. This suspicion was not entirely madness, as modern tests on her hair have shown high levels of mercury, suggesting a slow and deliberate assassination. For Ivan, this was the final proof that his court was a nest of vipers that could not be reformed but had to be destroyed. He became obsessed with the concept of purification through fire and blood, and his behavior grew increasingly erratic. As he began to retreat into a world of religious mysticism and paranoid isolation, he felt that God was punishing him for his sins, and that the only way to regain divine favor was to purge the kingdom of traitors. He was no longer the brilliant lawgiver of the 1550s. He was a man entering a state of total psychological warfare with his own people, preparing for a move that would shock the world and birth the most terrifying organization in the history of medieval Russia. In the winter of 1564, the inhabitants of Moscow woke to a sight that chilled the blood of the Boyard class. The Tsar had packed his icons, his treasury, and his family into a massive train of sledges and disappeared into the frozen forests without a word of explanation. He retreated to the small, fortified village of Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, and for weeks he maintained a terrifying silence that brought the machinery of the Russian state to a grinding halt. He then sent 2 letters back to the capital that were masterpieces of psychological manipulation. The first letter was addressed to the church and the nobles, accusing them of systemic corruption and treason, while the second was read aloud in the public squares to the common people, telling them that the Tsar had no anger toward them but could no longer rule a country infested with traitors. He was effectively inciting a revolution from above. The Muscovites, fearing the return of the Boyard anarchy that had plagued Ivan's childhood, surrounded the houses of the nobles and demanded that the Tsar be brought back at any cost. Ivan had created a vacuum and forced the elite to beg him to fill it. He agreed to return only on the condition that he be given the right to establish the Oprichnina, a separate territory within Russia that would be his personal domain, where his word was the only law and where he could execute anyone without the consent of the Boyar Council. The trap was sprung, and the legal foundations of the Russian state were replaced by the personal whims of a man who no longer believed in mercy. To enforce his new order, Ivan created the Oprichnina, a personal army of 6,000 men, who were recruited not for their noble blood, but for their absolute and fanatical loyalty to the Tsar. These men dressed in black robes and rode black horses, carrying the severed heads of dogs and wooden brooms on their saddles to symbolize that they would bite the enemies of the Tsar and sweep the filth from the land of Russia. They were a monastic order of executioners who lived in a commune with Ivan at Alexandrovskaya, where they would spend hours in prayer and then spend the nights in drunken orgies and the torture of prisoners. Ivan himself acted as their abbot, ringing the bells for prayer at dawn and leading the interrogations in the dungeons at dusk. The Oprichnina was the world's first modern police state, a shadow government that operated outside the law and targeted the ancient boyar families with a surgical and sadistic precision. Property was seized, families were executed in the middle of the night, and the very social fabric of Russia was torn apart as Ivan sought to replace the old aristocracy with a new class of men who owed their lives entirely to him. He was no longer a ruler of a nation, but the commander of a death cult that saw treason in every whisper and a demon in every shadow. The peak of the Black Terror arrived in 1570 when Ivan's paranoia turned toward the city of Novgorod. Once the proudest and most independent merchant republic in Russia, he became convinced through a forged letter that the leaders of the city were planning to defect to the Kingdom of Poland, and he led his Black Riders on a punitive expedition that would become one of the darkest chapters in human history. The city was surrounded, and for 5 weeks the Oprichnina systematically tortured and murdered the inhabitants, while Ivan watched from a specially built platform. Men, women and children were tied to sledges and run into the freezing waters of the Volkhov River, and those who floated were pushed back under with poles by soldiers in boats. The monasteries were looted, the granaries were burned, and the streets were piled high with the dead until the air itself became thick with the stench of decay. Contemporary chronicles claim that 60,000 people were killed, though modern historians suggest a more conservative but still horrific number. What mattered was the psychological effect. The once great city of Novgorod was broken forever, and the rest of Russia realized that no wall, no wealth, and no title could protect them from the wrath of the Grozny. Ivan had proven that he would rather rule a graveyard than a kingdom he could not control. While Ivan was busy destroying his own people, the enemies of Russia were watching from the borders. In 1571, the Crimean Conde Vladimir saw his opportunity and launched a massive raid that reached the very walls of Moscow. The Oprichnina, who were experts at torturing civilians, proved to be cowards in the face of a real army, and they failed to defend the capital as the Khan set the wooden city on fire. Moscow burned for days, and hundreds of thousands of people perished in the flames or were dragged away into slavery. Ivan, realizing that his Black Brotherhood had become a liability that could not protect the state, suddenly abolished the Oprichnina and executed many of its leaders with the same cruelty they had shown to others. He tried to erase the very memory of the Black Riders, forbidding anyone from even mentioning the name under penalty of death. But the damage was done. The economy was in ruins, the southern borders were vulnerable, and the Tsar's mind was now a fractured landscape of religious guilt and manic depression. He began to wander the palace halls again, just as he had as a child, but now he was haunted by the ghosts of the thousands he had sent to the grave. In 1581, the psychological tragedy of Ivan reached its absolute and most horrific climax within the private chambers of the Alexandrov Kremlin. The Tsar's eldest son and namesake, Tsarevich Ivan, was the only person who shared his father's intellect and the only hope for the survival of the Rurikid line. However, the Tsar's paranoia had begun to seep even into his love for his son, as he suspected. The young man of plotting to take the throne early. The tension exploded when Ivan entered his daughter-in-law's room and, finding her dressed in a way he deemed immodest, began to beat her so severely that she suffered a miscarriage. The Tsarevich rushed to defend his wife, and in the heat of a violent argument, he accused his father of losing the war in the north and destroying the kingdom. In a fit of uncontrollable Grozny rage, Ivan struck his son on the head with his heavy iron-tipped staff. The prince fell to the ground, his blood staining the ornate carpets of the palace, while the Tsar, suddenly realizing what he had done, threw himself over the body, screaming and begging for a forgiveness that the universe would not grant. For 3 days the heir lingered in agony, while the Tsar sat in a catatonic state of grief. And when the boy finally died, the future of Russia died with him. Ivan had committed the ultimate act of self-destruction, killing the only person he truly loved and leaving the crown to his younger son, Fyodor, who was mentally fragile and utterly incapable of ruling. The man who wanted to build an eternal empire had ensured its total collapse through his own hands. By 1584, the Tsar was a shell of a man, his body bloated by disease and his mind haunted by the screams of the thousands he had executed. He spent his final days wandering through the treasury of the Kremlin, touching his jewels and gold, as if they were the only things that still possessed any reality for him. He sought the counsel of witches and soothsayers from the north, asking them to predict the exact hour of his death and when. They told him he would die on the 18th of March. He spent the day in a state of frantic religious penance mixed with desperate hope. As the sun began to set on that day, he felt a surge of energy and called for his chess set to play a final game with his favorite courtier, Bogdan Belsky. He sat in his nightshirt, surrounded by the heavy silence of the palace, move by move, trying to control the board just as he had tried to control the vast wilderness of Russia. But as he reached for a piece, his hand began to tremble and he collapsed backward into his cushions, the air leaving his lungs for the last time. The witches had been right. The first Tsar of Russia was gone, and he left behind a nation that was exhausted, broken, and on the verge of the time of troubles. He had taken the wooden city of Moscow and turned it into an empire of stone and blood, but he had forgotten that an empire without a soul cannot survive the silence of its creator. The death of Ivan IV was not the end of his terror, but the beginning of a chaos that would nearly erase Russia from the map of history. Because he had killed his capable heir, the throne passed to Fyodor, the bell-ringer, whose reign was dominated by the rising power of the Boyar Boris Godunov. When Fyodor died childless, the Rurikid dynasty, which had ruled for 7 centuries, came to a pathetic and silent end. What followed was the time of troubles, a period of famine, civil war, and foreign invasion that saw false Tsars claiming to be Ivan's dead son, Dmitri rising from the shadows to lead peasant armies toward the gates of Moscow. The common people who had suffered the most under Ivan's Oprichnina ironically began to remember him as a strong father who had protected them from the greedy nobles. His legend began to morph from that of a monster into that of a holy protector who used violence only to save the soul of the nation. This psychological duality remains at the heart of the Russian identity today, the belief that a great leader must be a terrible leader, and that order can only be maintained through the constant threat of the sword. Ivan had built the architecture of the Russian state on a foundation of absolute fear, and for centuries his successors from Peter the Great to Joseph Stalin would find themselves looking back at the shadow of the Grozny for the blueprint of power. Modern science has attempted to perform the autopsy that medieval Russia could not, and the results have added a new layer of tragedy to the life of the first Tsar. When Ivan's tomb was opened in the 1960s, researchers found that his bones contained astronomical levels of mercury, a substance that was used in the 16th century to treat both physical pain and syphilis. This means that for much of his later reign, Ivan was likely suffering from chronic mercury poisoning, which causes extreme paranoia, irritability, and sudden bursts of violent rage. He was a man trapped inside a biological prison, his own brain being slowly dismantled by the very medicine intended to save him. His terrible nature was not just a product of his childhood trauma, but a physiological reaction to a world that did not understand the chemistry of the mind. Yet even this discovery does not erase the moral weight of his choices. He chose to institutionalize his paranoia into the Oprichnina. He chose to make terror a tool of statecraft, and he chose to rule through the death of the intellect. His life remains the ultimate case study in the corrupting nature of absolute authority and the terrifying truth that a leader's internal demons can become a nation's external nightmare. Ivan's transformation into the Grozny was fueled by a radical theological vision that saw Moscow not just as a city, but as the final bastion of true Christianity. He truly believed the doctrine of the Third Rome, the idea that after the fall of Constantinople, Moscow had become the sole heir to the Roman Empire, and that he was the living representative of God's justice on earth. This was not merely a political title for him, it was a burden that justified any level of brutality. He believed that as Tsar, he was responsible for the salvation of every soul in his kingdom, and if he allowed traitors to live, he was failing God himself. He spent his nights in prayer and his days in blood because, in his fractured mind, the two were inseparable. He saw himself as a holy surgeon cutting away the rotten flesh of the boyard class to save the body of the church. This divine ego allowed him to sleep while Moscow burned and to pray while the Volkhov River turned red with the blood of Novgorod. He had built a psychological fortress where his own trauma was rebranded as a religious crusade, making him immune to the whispers of his own conscience and ensuring that the Russian state would forever be tied to the idea of a sacred and absolute leader. The physical legacy of Ivan remains carved into the very stone of Moscow, most notably in the hypnotic and terrifying beauty of St. Basil's Cathedral. He wanted to create a city that reflected the power and the complexity of his own mind, a place where the grandeur of God was manifested through the absolute authority of the Tsar. But the cathedral stands as a monument to his contradictions, a place of vibrant colors built by a man whose soul was draped in the black of the Oprichnina. Legend says that after its completion, Ivan ordered the architects to be blinded, so that they could never reproduce such perfection for anyone else. A story that perfectly captures how his appreciation for beauty was always tied to a desire for total possession. Even today, the Kremlin carries the shadow of his reign in its walls. The secret passages and the deep dungeons where the first Tsar practiced his forensic interrogation of the human spirit. He was the architect of the Russian psyche, the man who taught the nation that order is only possible when it is enforced by a power so vast and so unpredictable that it resembles the wrath of nature itself. The final mystery of Ivan's life was uncovered centuries after his death, when his tomb in the Cathedral of the Archangel was opened for scientific study. Researchers found that his remains contained lethal concentrations of mercury, a substance that was used in the 16th century as a crude medicine for both physical pain and chronic ailments. For the last 20 years of his life, Ivan was being slowly poisoned by the very treatments meant to sustain him. Mercury poisoning leads to extreme mood swings, explosive rages, and profound paranoia. Symptoms that align perfectly with the timeline of his descent into the black terror of the Oprichnina. It is a tragic irony that the man who lived in constant fear of being poisoned was actually being dismantled from within by his own physicians. His terrible nature was a cocktail of childhood trauma, absolute power, and a deteriorating nervous system that turned every minor suspicion into a catastrophic war. His bones tell the story of a man trapped in a biological cage, a ruler whose internal chemical imbalance became the external tragedy of an entire empire, proving that the health of the Tsar was indeed the health of the state. When Ivan's heart finally stopped, the Rurikid dynasty, which had ruled for 700 years, was already effectively dead. His murder of his eldest son had left the crown to Fyodor the bell ringer, a gentle and mentally fragile soul who was more interested in the sounds of church bells than the governance of a fractured empire. When Fyodor died, childless, the lineage vanished into the vacuum of history, leading to the time of troubles. It was a period of total anarchy, famine, and foreign occupation that nearly saw Russia swallowed by its neighbors. Out of this darkness emerged the Romanov dynasty, the family of Ivan's beloved first wife, Anastasia, who would rule for the next 300 years. The Romanovs inherited the machinery of the state that Ivan had built, the professional army, the centralized laws, and the absolute authority of the crown, but they also inherited the ghost of the Grozny, the memory of what happens when a leader loses his grip on reality and turns the power of the state against its own people. Ivan's reign remained the standard against which every future Tsar would be measured, a warning and a blueprint that defined the borders of what Russia could be and what it could survive. The Odyssey of Ivan IV ends, not with a final resolution, but with a permanent question that still haunts the halls of power. How much blood is the security of a nation worth, and can a leader truly save his people by destroying their spirit? Ivan was the man who took a collection of medieval principalities and forged them into a modern empire through the sheer force of his own terrified will. He was a brilliant reformer, a devout scholar, and a cold-blooded executioner who saw no contradiction between these roles. His life remains the ultimate case study in the architecture of absolute power and the way that personal trauma can be institutionalized into a national ideology. He is the eternal Grozny, the thunderous one, whose name is still spoken with a mixture of pride and horror in the streets of Moscow. He taught the world that fear is a more effective tool of statecraft than love, and that the shadow of a single man can stretch across centuries. As the final bells of his reign fade into the silence of history, we are left with the image of a man sitting alone in the dark of the Kremlin, playing a game of chess against a fate he had already lost. The Odyssey is complete. Ivan was not just a medieval monarch. He was the unintentional architect of the modern surveillance state. Through the Oprichnina, he created the first system, where a leader's personal security was entirely decoupled from the national interest, allowing the ruler to treat his own citizens as an occupied population. He realized that if you could control the flow of information and maintain a state of permanent fear, you could mobilize a nation's resources with a speed that no democracy could ever match. His methods of using a dedicated secret police to bypass traditional legal structures would be studied by every Russian leader who followed, from the Oprichnina of the Tsars to the Cheka of the Bolsheviks. He taught the world that the most effective way to consolidate power is to create an internal enemy that only the leader can defeat, making his own authority indispensable to the survival of the people. He was a forensic analyst of the human spirit. who knew that once a person has seen the darkness of the torture chamber, they will never truly be free again. And this realization became the cold foundation upon which the Russian Empire was built, ensuring that the legacy of the Grozny would remain a living force in the corridors of the Kremlin for centuries to come. For hundreds of years, historians have fought over the true nature of Ivan IV, asking whether he was a visionary statesman who was forced into violence by a treacherous nobility or a clinical psychopath, whose reign was a long descent into madness. The Soviet era saw a rehabilitation of his image under Joseph Stalin, who commissioned the great filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein to create an epic movie about Ivan. Stalin saw himself in the first Tsar, a fellow reformer who had to purge his own ranks to prepare his country for war. Yet in the West, Ivan remained the archetype of the Oriental despot, a man whose cruelty was seen as a symptom of a backwards and barbaric culture. The truth, as always, lies in the complex grey area between these extremes. He was a man of his time, a ruler of a fractured land who believed that absolute unity was the only alternative to total destruction. He was a brilliant intellectual who could debate theology with the best minds in Europe, and a butcher who could personally oversee the execution of his own friends. He was the living embodiment of the contradictions of Russia itself, a nation that seeks the enlightenment of the West while clinging to the autocracy of the East. And it is in this tension that his myth continues to breathe. If we look at the life of Ivan as a single narrative arc, we see the tragedy of a man who was given everything but was never allowed to feel safe. His childhood trauma created a vacuum in his heart that he tried to fill with territory, with laws, with religion, and eventually with blood. But the more power he gained, the more vulnerable he felt, leading to a cycle of escalation that eventually consumed his own family and his own sanity. He was a man who tried to outrun the ghosts of his childhood, only to find that he was the one who had become the ghost. His terrible nature was not a choice he made in a vacuum, but a response to a world that had taught him that the only way to survive was to be the most dangerous person in the room. He was a man who achieved the pinnacle of human authority only to realize that he was still the same frightened boy who had watched his mother die in the silent halls of the Kremlin. His life remains a warning about the limits of human resilience and the terrifying power of a single individual to rewrite the history of a civilization through the lens of their own brokenness. The bells of Moscow are finally silent, and the smoke of the Oprichnina has cleared, leaving behind a landscape that was changed forever by the hand of one man. Ivan IV was the thunder that broke the drought of the medieval ages and the fire that forged the modern Russian Empire. He was a man of gold and iron, of incense and blood, a ruler who lived in the absolute extremes of human experience. His odyssey ends not with a victory or a defeat, but with a permanent presence in the psyche of the nation he created. He taught us that power is a mirror that reflects the soul of the one who holds it, and if that soul is fractured, the kingdom will follow. As we close this chapter of Historicon, we are left with the image of the first Tsar sitting in his white nightshirt, staring at a chessboard with no more moves left to make. He has become part of the very earth he conquered, a silent guardian of the Third Rome whose name will be whispered as long as the Kremlin towers stand against the sky. The Odyssey is complete, and the Grozny is finally at peace with the darkness he created. As the screen fades to a deep and resonant black, we realize that Ivan was never just a man, he was a transition, a violent and necessary bridge between the loose principalities of the Middle Ages and the iron-fisted superpower of the modern era. He taught Russia that unity has a price, and that the price is often measured in the blood of the innocent. His reign established the terrifying precedent that for Russia to be great, its leader must be absolute. A lesson that would be absorbed and refined by every occupant of the Kremlin, from the Romanovs to the modern day. The Grozny is not a ghost of the past, but a permanent resident of the Russian psyche. A reminder that the thunder of authority is the only thing that can hold back the silence of chaos. We leave Ivan not in the dungeons of the Oprichnina, but in the silence of the cathedral where his bones still rest. He was a man who wanted to build a kingdom of God, but ended up building a monument to human fear. He was the first to take the title of Tsar, and he was the first to realize that the title carries a weight that can crush the mind of even the strongest ruler. His life was a tragic paradox, a brilliant scholar who destroyed the books he loved, a devout Christian who murdered his own clergy, and a father who killed the future of his own dynasty. He remains the mirror in which Russia sees its own capacity for grandeur and its own capacity for devastation. An eternal figure standing at the crossroads of history, holding a scepter in one hand and a dagger in the other. The Odyssey of Ivan IV is now complete. We have walked through the golden corridors of his childhood and the blood-stained streets of his final terror. We have seen the child become a god and the god become a monster. His name remains etched into the very foundations of the Eastern world, a name that inspires both pride and trembling. Grozny, the thunderous one, the magnificent, the terrible. The story of Ivan is the story of power without limits, and the realization that the greatest enemy of a Tsar is not the bojar at the gate, but the demon in the mirror. As the final bells of Moscow fade into the distance, we are left with the chilling truth that history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And the rhyme of Ivan IV is still being written in the heart of the empire he forged.